The ruts that passed for a road through Harlan's Bluff were already stiffening in the October cold, the mud that had swallowed wagon wheels all summer, now hardening into frozen ridges, sharp enough to turn an ankle. Wren Calloway had walked that road 10,000 times in her 26 years, knew every dip and stone of it, the way she knew the grain of the pine table inside the cabin, the way she knew the precise weight of a splitting maul when the handle was wet. She was not thinking about the road. She was thinking about the birch rounds stacked beside the chopping block. How many she still needed to split before the first real snow. How the pile needed to be 4 feet deep along the north wall before she could sleep easy. The ringing crack of the maul was the only sound in the valley that morning, clean and final, each split log falling away from the block with a satisfying surrender. She heard the wagon before she saw it. The particular creak of iron wheel rims on frozen ground carried far and cold air, and she knew without looking that it was coming from the eastern road, the one that led back toward Garrison. She set the maul head on the block and waited, her breath rising in small white columns. Two men. She could tell by the weight of the horses the way the rig sat. When the wagon crested the low rise and she could make out the figures, her hands stayed loose at her sides. Edmund Hart sat on the bench with the stillness of a man who has rehearsed a scene so many times it has ceased to require his full attention. Beside him, Sheriff Roy Decker held the reins with both hands and kept his gaze fixed on the horse's ears as though they might bolt at any moment. Hart climbed down first. He was a tall man, thin in the shoulders, but thick through the middle, the kind of thickness that came from decades of sitting behind desks rather than from labor. His coat was good wool, double-breasted, and he wore it with the unconscious ease of someone who had never had to decide between a coat and a month's flour. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm. Decker came down second, slower, his face arranged into an expression of professional neutrality that didn't quite reach his eyes. Wren did not invite them inside. She stood beside the chopping block with the maul handle resting against her thigh and waited for one of them to speak first. Hart set the portfolio on the wagon's footboard and withdrew a folded document with the deliberate pace of a man who understood that ceremony was a form of power. He unfolded it, smoothed it flat with one palm, held it toward her. The document was stamped and sealed, the kind of paper that courthouses produce to transform one man's claim into another man's loss. Wren took it. She read it once slowly, the way her father had taught her to read any contract, not for what it said, but for what it assumed. The transfer of title was dated June 14, 1879. It bore her father's name on the signature line, Alistair W. Calloway, conveying 160 acres, including all improvements, water rights and mineral claims to Edmund J. Hart, in satisfaction of an outstanding debt. The notary seal was from Garrison. The judge's affirmation stamp was from Helena. She looked at the signature. The loop on the capital A was generous, almost ornate. Alistair Calloway had gripped tools for 30 years, had set 10,000 stones, had driven stakes, and hauled timber and pried boulders from creek beds. His handwriting was a working man's hand, cramped direct, the letters formed, with the same economy he applied to every physical task. That A had never in any letter or deed or receipt Wren had seen him sign carried a loop like that. The pen had moved too freely, too confidently in a hand that had never held a splitting maul. She looked at the ink. That was the second thing. The color was too uniform, too black, the kind of consistency produced by a mill-ground formulation that had only been commercially available in the Montana Territory for 2, perhaps 3 years at the outside. She had seen the receipts when the general store in Garrison began carrying it. She remembered because her father had refused to buy it, had said his old cake ink was adequate for a man who only needed to sign his name a few times a year. This ink had not existed in 1879. The signature had been made with ink that didn't exist on the date the document claimed. She folded the paper with great care and handed it back. My father paid every debt he owed. Her voice came out, even the words placed like stones. He kept records. Hart received the document with a small, patient smile, the expression of a man accustomed to this particular species of objection. The records I have tell a different story, Miss Calloway. The court in Helena has already reviewed the matter. Sheriff Decker has the affirmation. He tucked the portfolio back under his arm. You have until the first significant snowfall. That's generous given the legal standing. Decker finally looked at her. His face carried something she recognized as genuine discomfort, the expression of a man who had arrived at a destination he hadn't chosen. I'm sorry, Miss Calloway. The document is sealed. My hands are tied on this one. He said it quietly, and she believed that he was sorry, which didn't change anything, but she noted it. She looked at Hart for a long moment. He had the patience of someone who had won before the game began. She had seen that expression before on men who owned banks and on men who owned politicians. And it was always the same expression, a kind of mild, settled superiority that didn't bother to become contempt, because contempt required effort. I understand, she said. That was all. She turned back to the chopping block, set a new round of birch, lifted them all. The crack of the split rang out across the frozen valley before the wagon had finished turning around. The memory came back to her that evening, the way memories did when her hands were occupied, and her mind was quiet, not summoned, but arriving on their own terms through a side door. She had been 15 the summer of 1872. The air had smelled of cut pine and damp clay, and her father had been deep in the hillside, his voice coming up from underground with a particular quality of resonance she associated even now with certainty. Alistair Calloway was not a man given to unnecessary explanation. He spoke when he had something to say and was silent when he didn't, a characteristic that had made him few friends in garrison, but had earned him the particular respect given to people who mean what they say. That summer he was building something he had not fully described to anyone, and Wren had been his only assistant, carrying flat stones from Copperhead Creek in a canvas sling until her shoulders ached mixing clay and dry grass into the thick paste he used to dress the timber joints. She had asked him once why they were building so far from the cabin. He had paused in his digging, leaned on the long-handled shovel, looked out at the valley spread below them in the August heat. You build for the winter you don't see coming. He said it the way he said most things, not as advice, but as simple fact, the way he would say that granite didn't crack the same way sandstone did, or that a south-facing slope shed snow faster than a north-facing one. A fire, a sickness, a man with a piece of paper who's been patient long enough. She hadn't understood the last part. She was 15 and the valley seemed like a permanent thing, and Edmund Hart was merely the man who owned the bank in garrison, not yet a presence in their daily life. The hinge of the whole enterprise was what her father called thermal mass, the capacity of dense material to absorb heat slowly and release it even more slowly. He explained it with the same straightforward pleasure he took in explaining any physical principle, the way some men talked about scripture or politics, as though the laws governing the natural world were the most interesting thing a person could know. Down here, 4 feet below where the frost stops, the temperature never changes. He had pressed her palm flat against the earthen wall that first afternoon, and she had felt it cool but not cold, steady, utterly constant. Not the hottest day in July, not the coldest night in January. The ground holds the heat from August the way old people hold memories. It doesn't lose them. The ventilation was the part that had required the most patience to build correctly. He had learned the principle from a man named Silas Drum, a stonemason from the hill country of Western Virginia, who had come north after the war with nothing but his tools and what he knew. Drum had built root cellars and spring houses across 2 territories, had learned from necessity that air moved in predictable directions, cold and dense along the floor, warm and light toward the ceiling, and that you could use that movement the way you used a river current to carry what you needed and remove what you didn't. 2 pipes Alistair had explained, showing her where he'd set them into the timbered ceiling. A low intake 4 inches in diameter, a high exhaust set beside the main beam. Without both, the air turned foul. Without both, a fire won't draw. She had asked why he was lining the walls with stone instead of the cured boards most people used. He had looked at her with an expression she now understood as the particular satisfaction of a teacher whose student has asked exactly the right question. Wood rots. Stone doesn't forget its shape. He fit 2 flat river stones together, dry without mortar, with a precision that made the joint almost invisible. Silas taught me this. You don't need mortar if you choose the stones right. Mortar is what you use when you don't trust your own judgment. She had stacked stones beside him until dark, and he had shown her how to read a face of rock for its natural grain, where it wanted to split, where it would hold. The work had a satisfaction she recognized even then as something close to the satisfaction of understanding the feeling of a thing fitting together correctly, of the world making sense in a particular corner. He had finished the hatch, last a stone slab heavy enough to require a lever to move, fitted into a frame of squared timbers set flush with the hillside. A gnarled juniper grew at the edge of the site, its roots already beginning to creep toward the frame. He had let them. By the time another decade passed, those roots would make the hatch look like part of the hill itself. She had asked him about the food stores, the tools, the carefully rolled blankets she had carried down the steps and stacked against the far wall. Preparation, he had said, is only arrogance if you don't share what you've prepared. He handed her a flat piece of shale and a piece of iron nail for scratching. Draw what you see, the layout, the pipe positions, the stove design when we build it. She had looked at him, uncertain what he meant. You'll want to remember this exactly, he had said. Not approximately, exactly. She had drawn everything. In the days after Hart's visit, the valley watched her with the particular intensity of a community that expects to witness a defeat. She was seen splitting the remainder of the birchwood, working through the early mornings, when the cold was sharpest, her breath rising in steady plumes. She made one trip into Garrison, walking the 6 miles with a list in her coat pocket. At the general store, Myron Abercrombie would not extend credit. Hart held the note on his inventory, had made his expectations clear. She bought what she could with coin: a small sack of coarse salt, 2 boxes of waterproof matches, 30 feet of hemp rope, a single stitching needle. These were not the purchases of a woman making arrangements to leave. Several people in Garrison noted that and said nothing. Nettie Sims found her on the boardwalk outside the feed store, pressed a small wrapped parcel into her hand, a 1/4 pound of butter still cool from the cellar. Don't let him see, Nettie's voice low, her eyes already moving past Wren's shoulder. She was a compact woman, sharp-featured, who had outlasted a husband and 3 bad harvests by the force of practical intelligence. Wren thanked her with a nod that Nettie received with one of her own, and they went their separate ways. The minister's wife offered the church attic. 2 other women offered rooms. Wren declined each offer with the same quiet firmness, the words arranged so that refusal seemed less like pride than like the statement of a simple fact she was managing. The kindness of the valley was genuine, she knew that, but kindness built on pity was a foundation that would shift under weight, and she had no time for foundations that shifted. She walked the 6 miles back to the homestead with the salt and matches and rope in her pack, and the butter Nettie had given her wrapped in cloth against her chest for warmth. The sky had taken on the flat pewter quality that came before serious weather. Not the dramatic darkness of a thunderstorm, but something quieter and more patient, the sky of a season that had made up its mind. The consensus in Garrison, unspoken, running underneath conversations like a current under ice, was that Wren Calloway's pride would serve as its own punishment. A week, perhaps 2. The land was Hart's on paper, and the winter was nobody's ally. She was 26 and alone, and the mountains didn't negotiate. From his new front porch, the porch her father had built by hand, the planks still bearing the particular marks of Alistair's adze, Edmund Hart watched the smoke rise from the cabin chimney each morning with an expression his housekeeper would later describe as satisfaction, the expression of a man whose patience was being confirmed. On the 3rd of November, Wren made her final preparations. She moved through their cabin with the deliberate economy of someone who has decided what matters and has stopped arguing with herself about the rest. The cast iron pot, 2 wool blankets, the whetstone, the tin of matches, the salt, the rope, a change of wool underclothes, a spare pair of heavy socks, her father's leather work gloves. She did not take the curtains her mother had made, though she paused at the window for a moment with her hand on the fabric. She did not take the crock of dried apple rings on the shelf above the stove, though she had put them up herself in September, and they would last the winter. She took the maul. She went to the lean-to beside the barn, where her nanny goat Hazel was tethered in the straw. Hazel was a stocky brown animal of uncertain temperament who had been her father's gift on her 16th birthday, and who had outlasted 3 harsh winters with a sturdy, cheerful indifference to hardship that Wren had always found quietly encouraging. She untied the rope, and the goat pressed its broad forehead against her palm with the casual affection of an animal that has never doubted its own welcome. The town expected her to walk east toward the Charity of Garrison or the longer road to Helena. She walked west. The foothills rose ahead of her in tiers, their lower slopes stripped of color by October, the higher elevations already whitened by the early snows that had fallen in the past week and stayed. Hazel walked at her left side with the unhurried competence of an animal that has made peace with being led by someone it trusts. The wind came from the northwest, carrying the particular smell of weather that had already committed itself, not the wet cold of a storm still negotiating with the atmosphere, but the dry metallic cold of a system that had finished deliberating. Behind her, the homestead receded into the gray afternoon. The smoke from the chimney was already thinning, the fire burning down without anyone to tend it, the cabin beginning its long surrender to the season. She did not look back. 3 minutes after she cleared the first rise, the sky released its first hard grains of snow, not falling so much as driving each particle small and sharp and purposeful, the opening declaration of a winter that had been preparing itself for months. The homestead she had left dropped from sight. Edmund Hart, watching from the porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, saw the smoke thinning, saw the property settling into vacancy, and felt the clean satisfaction of a plan arriving at its intended conclusion. He went back inside. He did not see the direction she had walked. The knowledge she carried with her was not in her pack. It occupied no weight, took no space, required no carrying. It was simply there the way her own hands were there, present, available, part of the instrument she had become, in the years since a summer afternoon on a south-facing hillside, when a man who trusted stone more than paper had pressed his daughter's palm against a living wall and told her that the earth did not forget what it had been given. She walked into the hills with that knowledge and a goat and a maul and 30 feet of rope, and the cold gathered itself around her with the impersonal efficiency of a force that does not take sides. She knew where she was going. The slope steepened past the first ridge, the frozen grass crunching under her boots with a sound like broken crockery. Hazel's hooves found purchase on the icy rock with the confidence of an animal built for exactly this terrain, picking her way between outcroppings with a precision that suggested she had walked this path before, or that her feet contained some knowledge her brain had never bothered to organize into thought. Wren had not been to the hatch since the summer of 1876, 4 years before her father's first confrontation with Hart, 7 years after the building was finished. She had gone up to check the stores, to replace 2 blankets that had gone damp, to reseat a section of the intake pipe that had shifted in a late frost. Alistair had come with her that time, moving more slowly than she remembered, his breathing effortful on the uphill sections in a way that she had registered but not spoken of. He had sat on the stone outside the hatch while she went down to check the interior, and when she came back up, he was looking out over the valley with an expression she hadn't had a name for then. She had one now. It was the expression of a man surveying something he was nearly finished with. He had died in February of 1882, 3 weeks into a cold that had settled over the territory like a verdict. The illness had come on fast, the way chest sicknesses did in men past 50, who had spent decades breathing the particular dust of stone-cutting work. A dry cough first, then fever, then the wet, tearing sound that meant the lungs were losing the argument. She had kept the fire as high as the wood supply allowed, had made broths from the last of the salt pork, had sat through 4 nights reading to him from the book he kept on the shelf above his work table. Marcus Aurelius, the meditations of a man who had governed an empire and found that the only territory worth governing was the one between a person's ears. He had not said much in his last days. He was not a man who used deathbed speeches. But on the 3rd morning, when his fever had broken briefly and his eyes were clear, he had looked at her with an expression of absolute directness and said, "The hatch. You know the way. Don't wait for someone to make you go." She had understood him to mean, don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the situation to become so desperate that you have no choice but the one choice. Go when you can still go well. She had buried him in the frozen ground east of the barn under the cottonwood he had planted the year she was born. 8 months later, Edmund Hart's wagon had appeared on the eastern road for the first time. The juniper came into view as the light was starting to fail a gnarled, wind-shaped tree whose branches bent permanently toward the south, as though it had spent its entire life trying to lean away from the mountain. The roots had done their work. They had crept across the face of the hillside in the intervening years, thick gray ropes of them, lacing over and around the edge of the stone hatch, anchoring it into the slope so naturally that you would have needed to know it was there to see it. She tied Hazel to a lower branch and set the pack down. The maul head she used as a lever, working the handle under the lip of the hatch, where the roots had left a narrow gap. The stone was heavier than she had expected, and it took 3 attempts before the slab shifted, grinding against the frozen earth with a deep, reluctant sound. She got it a foot 2 feet, enough to prop open with a length of branch she pulled from the deadwood at the base of the juniper. The air that rose from the opening was not warm in any dramatic sense. It was simply not cold. In contrast to the knifing air of the hillside, 50 degrees felt like stepping into a room where someone has recently been living, where the temperature carries the residue of human presence. She held her face over the opening for a moment and let that air move across her skin. She struck a match, the waterproof kind which her father had insisted on, and shielded the small flame with her cupped hands as she descended the stone steps. 7 steps exactly as she remembered. The ceiling of the chamber was 6 feet at the center lower. At the walls, the heavy timbers set with the care of a man who understood load distribution. The walls were the dry stacked stone of her father's particular craft, each rock chosen for its face, and its bearing fitted without mortar in the technique Silas Drum had carried out of the Virginia Hill Country like a tool he'd never put down. Along the far wall, exactly as she had arranged them years ago, sacks of dried beans flour sealed in tin-lined crates against moisture. 2 small casks, one of salt pork packed in brine, one of black molasses. A crate held candles, more matches, an old mercury thermometer, a coil of wire. The tools were there: shovel, pickaxe, a small hand-crank auger, a bow saw. 3 wool blankets tightly rolled, wrapped in oilskin against the ears. On top of the crate, weighted by a flat stone, was the oilskin pouch. She opened it carefully, her cold fingers clumsy with the ties. Inside, a single folded sheet of her father's letter paper, his handwriting precise and deliberate, in the way of a man who wrote infrequently enough to treat each letter as a commitment. It did not begin with her name. It did not begin with sentiment. It began the way Alistair Calloway began most things, in the middle, as though the thought had been going on for some time before the pen touched the paper. The design for the stove is on the back of this sheet. The clay for mortar is in the floor dig 6 inches below the northwest corner. Mix it with the dry grass from the bundle beside the saw. Let it set 3 full days before you heat it. Not 2, 3. She turned the page. The drawing was meticulous, dimensioned with annotations in his cramped hand, indicating the exact placement of the flue relative to the ventilation pipe. Below the drawing is a list of names. 7. These are the people in the valley who will need what you know before the winter is finished. The first name is not who you expect. Teach all of them the same. Knowledge held by one person is a nail with no wood to go into. She read the list. The first name was Edmund Hart. She read it twice. The name sat on the page with the same neutral precision as the others. No explanation, no elaboration. Alistair's handwriting, giving it no more weight than it gave to Nettie Sims or Cal Brandt or Reverend Oakes. She thought about what it meant that her father, who had known exactly what Hart intended and had built this entire place against that intention, had still put the man's name on a list of people worth teaching. She folded the paper and put it inside her coat against her chest. Then she looked at the space around her, the cold, dry air, the stone walls that had been standing for 11 years without complaint, the supplies her father's hands had carried down these steps one bag at a time, and understood that she was not beginning something. She was arriving at something that had already been prepared for her patiently by a man who trusted the earth to hold what paper could not. She went back up the steps and untied Hazel. The snow was coming harder now, thick and resolute, accumulating on the flat surfaces of stone and bark, with the quiet industry of a force that has decided. The valley below had already begun to disappear, its edges softening into white, the familiar shapes of cabins and fences and roads blurring toward abstraction. By morning, Garrison would be a rumor. By the end of the week, the homestead Edmund Hart was already thinking of as his would be buried under a foot of snow that would press down on it without judgment or malice, the way time pressed on everything. Wren brought the goat down the steps into the chamber, let the hatch fall back into place, and stood in the dark for a moment before striking another match. The flame showed her the room again. The walls, the stores, the drawing of the stove on the back of her father's letter. The work that needed doing. She set the match to a candle stub she found in the crate, and in that small, steady light, with the snow muffling the world above and the earth holding its constant temperature below, she picked up the shovel and began. The clay came out of the northwest corner in dark, dense chunks, almost black, where it had never dried, holding the cold of the deep earth, the way iron holds heat, slowly, completely reluctant to give it up. Wren worked the shovel in short, controlled strokes, prying rather than digging, letting the tool find the weakness rather than imposing her own. 6 inches down, the clay changed texture, became more plastic, more willing. She dug until she had enough to fill the small wooden bucket she found beside the pickaxe, then mixed in the dry grass from the bundle her father had left folded rather than stirred the way you work flour into dough, until the grass fibers ran through the clay in every direction, giving it the tensile strength it would need to hold a fire's expansion without cracking. 3 days. He had written it twice, underlining the number once. Not 2, 3. She built the firebox from the loose stone pile in the corner, choosing each piece with the same patience she had watched Alistair apply, reading the face of the rock, finding the flat-bearing surface, fitting rather than forcing. The mortar went on in thin coats, smoothed with her thumb, where the gap required sealing left dry, where the stone faces met cleanly enough. The work warmed her hands despite the cold of the chamber, the physical logic of it engaging the part of her mind that quieted everything else. The flue was the part that required the most precision. Her father had left a section of hollowed log pine about 4 inches in diameter, the interior charred to reduce moisture absorption. She set it into the timbered ceiling beside the main exhaust pipe, packing the junction with clay mortar, pressing it in with a stick where her fingers couldn't reach. If the seal failed, smoke would fill the chamber instead of rising out of it, turning her refuge into something closer to a trap. She packed the joint 3 times over, smoothing each layer before applying the next, then sat back on her heels to look at the whole assembly in the candlelight. It was not beautiful, it was correct. She set the candle down, wrapped herself in 2 of the wool blankets, lay on the pine needle mattress she had built against the east wall, closed her eyes. Hazel settled into the small pen she had constructed near the entrance. 3 walls of stacked stone, a floor of pine boughs. The goat's compact body generating a steady, modest warmth that raised the temperature of the outer chamber by perhaps 3 degrees. Wren had calculated this. 3 degrees at the margins was not nothing. The 3 days of curing passed in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the world above and everything to do with the world immediately at hand. She sorted the food stores, inventoried what was their calculated consumption rates against the length of a Montana winter. In the worst case, she was willing to plan for 120 days. The beans were the foundation, dense with calories, slow to cook, but slow to spoil. The salt pork she would use sparingly, more for flavor than bulk, stretching it across weeks. The molasses she rationed by the spoonful, a measure of sweetness that served also as a reminder that the world outside this chamber still contained things worth returning to. On the second day, she found the book wedged between the crate of candles in the south wall. Her father's copy of the Meditations, the cover worn soft as old cloth, the spine cracked in 3 places from years of being open to the same passages. She opened it without intention, the way you open something familiar, not to find a particular page, but to find the book itself. The words her eyes landed on were, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." She read it twice, closed the book, set it on the flat stone she had designated as a shelf. There was too much work left to sit with philosophy. On the 3rd morning, she pressed her thumb against the clay joint at the base of the firebox. It did not yield. She pressed harder, driving the thumbnail in. The surface scored but did not crack, held its form with the quiet stubbornness of a thing that has cured past argument. 3 days. He had been right, as he had been right about most things that could be measured. She built the first fire from the driest pine in the stack. Small pieces, nothing larger than her thumb, for the first burn, coaxing rather than commanding. The kindling caught on the second match. Smoke rose into the flue, paused for one uncertain moment, then moved with purpose upward and out. The draft was clean. She fed 3 small splits into the box, no more watching the flame establish its character before asking more of it. The thermometer she hung from a nail in the ceiling timber read 41 degrees in the outer chamber. She built the heated stone system exactly as her father had drawn it, 3 large flat river stones set directly on the firebox lid, given 2 hours to absorb heat until they were too hot to touch with bare skin. Then, using doubled canvas as a carrier, she moved them one by one into the blanket tent she had hung from the ceiling ropes, a space perhaps 6 feet by 4, just large enough to sleep in with the knees slightly bent, the ceiling low enough to warm quickly from body heat alone. She sealed the tent flap with a wooden pin she had whittled from a branch. 40 minutes later, she opened the flap, held the small backup thermometer inside at arm's length, waited. 58 degrees. In a stone chamber buried in a Montana hillside in November, 58 degrees was not comfort in any ordinary sense of the word. It was survival made warm enough to think clearly in. It was her father's logic proven the abstraction of 11 years ago, now a physical fact she could hold a thermometer to. She pressed her palm flat against the east wall, the same gesture she had made as a girl when he guided her hand to the living soil. The stone was cool, not cold, holding its temperature with the unhurried constancy of something that measures time in centuries. In that moment, with the snow packed thick overhead and the world above frozen into stillness, she felt the full weight of what he had given her. Not the food or the tools or the blankets, but the understanding that the earth itself was an ally if you took the trouble to learn its terms. She let herself cry then, not from fear or relief, but from something that didn't have a clean name. Grief for the man who had built this gratitude that felt almost like pain. The complicated emotion of a person who has arrived somewhere she was prepared for by someone who did not live to see the preparation succeed. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone, let the feeling move through her, gave it its due time. Then she straightened, wiped her face with the back of her wrist, took the small, smooth stone from her coat pocket. Her father's thinking stone, flat and dark, worn to a shine on one side. From decades of his thumb, set it on the wall ledge at shoulder height, exactly where a man of his height would have rested his hand. There, that was the shrine. Everything else was work. Sheriff Roy Decker rode out 4 days after the first major storm broke, not because Hart had ordered it, but because he couldn't sleep. He had been a lawman in the territory for 11 years, had seen disputes over water rights turn fatal, had served eviction papers on widows, had once arrested a circuit preacher for fraud. He had learned to carry the weight of his office without letting it bend him. The Calloway matter had a different quality. It sat in his chest like a stone with a rough edge catching on something every time he tried to breathe past it. He found the homestead vacant, the snow undisturbed around the door, the chimney cold. He followed her tracks from the woodpile, already faint under 2 days of additional snowfall, but readable to a man who had spent his adult life reading what the ground remembered. They led west into the foothills toward the rising flank of Sable Ridge. He followed them on horseback until the terrain made riding impractical, then on foot until the tracks disappeared into a section of hillside where the snow had been disturbed by wind and the roots of a large juniper made the ground difficult to read. He stood there in the cold, studying the hillside, seeing nothing except rock and snow and the bent architecture of the juniper. Then he saw the wisp. It was barely visible in the brightness of the post-storm sky, a thread of gray against the blue rising from what appeared to be a seam in the snowpack near the juniper's base. So thin it could have been vapor from a warm rock. But the angle was wrong for that, the drift too steady, the movement too vertical for wind effect. Someone had built a flue. He called her name. The sound seemed small in all that open white silence, reduced to something almost apologetic by the scale of the landscape around it. The hatch opened. Wren Calloway climbed out into the winter sunlight, squinting against the brightness, a shovel in her hand. She was thinner than she had been in October, the planes of her face more prominent, the skin at her cheekbones tight from cold and effort. Her eyes, however, were entirely clear, carrying the focused calm of a person with too much to do to afford any other expression. Decker stared. His mind attempted to organize what he was seeing. The thin smoke, the living woman, the goat that appeared behind her at the hatch opening to investigate into a framework that made sense. It declined. "Miss Calloway." His voice came out with an uncertainty he hadn't intended. He gestured at the hillside, at the smoke, at her. I thought, "I'm managing." 2 words placed with the same economy she used for everything. She looked at him without hostility, without warmth, with the level attention of someone assessing a situation's requirements. He left without another word, leading his horse back down through the snow. His report to Hart that afternoon was brief. She was alive. She appeared to be well. He didn't know how. Edmund Hart received this information standing in the front room of the Calloway homestead, which he had begun furnishing with pieces brought from his house in Garrison. The room was cold despite the fire. The cabin had a drafty north wall that Hart's housekeeper had stuffed with rags to inadequate effect. He stood with his back to the fire, which was the only warm position available, and heard Decker out. His expression did not change during the report. It changed after once Decker had gone. Something moved behind his eyes, not panic, but the particular recalculation of a man whose plan has encountered a variable he had not priced in. He sent word to Garrison the following morning. The message was addressed to his attorney and contained questions about the legal definition of trespass as applied to subsurface structures on contested land. The attorney's reply, which arrived 3 days later, was not encouraging. January arrived with the blue norther that the old-timers had been predicting since October. Not a storm in the dramatic sense, but something worse. A sustained Arctic settlement, a high-pressure system that parked itself over the northern Rockies and refused to move for 2 weeks. The sky during the days was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind of blue that looks warm in paintings but means something else entirely at 40 below zero. There was no wind. The cold had no need of wind. It simply sat. Cal Brandt appeared at the Juniper on the 8th day of the Norther, a Tuesday his two children wrapped in everything they own and still shaking their lips the pale blue of creek ice. His wife Mabel was back at their claim burning with a fever that had started 3 days ago when their last firewood ran out. He had burned the kitchen chairs. He had burned the boards from the back wall of the pantry. He had tried to fell a pine on the ridge and miscalculated the angle the tree had come down on the back wall of their barn instead of away from it. And he had walked the mile to Wren's hillside with the kind of desperation that doesn't waste breath on pride. He was a broad man, 51 years old, with a stonemason's forearms and a farmer's deeply weathered face. Standing in the entrance of the hatch, looking at the stone walls and the small glowing stove and the stacked supplies and the goat that regarded him with philosophical disinterest, he experienced something that moved across his face like weather. Wren brought the children in first, sat them beside the stove, poured hot bean broth into the tin cups she used for herself. They wrapped their hands around the cups and said nothing, their bodies too focused on the work of warming to spare anything for words. The older child, a boy of about 6, looked at the stone walls with eyes that were still slightly glassy from cold, then looked at Wren with an expression of uncomplicated trust that she found in a way she hadn't expected almost unbearable in its simplicity. She told Cal to go back for Mabel. She told him to bring her on the sled if she couldn't walk, to use the rope she gave him tied around his waist so he wouldn't lose direction if the cold confused him. He looked at the rope in his hand, then at his children drinking hot broth beside a working stove in a stone room buried in a hillside, then back at Wren. "I've been building for 30 years. His voice had the particular roughness of a man who doesn't speak until something needs saying. "I never built anything like this." Wren took a piece of charcoal from beside the stove, found a flat section of the stone wall, began to draw. The firebox first dimensions proportions the angle of the flue relative to the exhaust pipe. The cold sink trench. The placement of the intake pipe low, the exhaust high, the physics of the movement that kept the air from souring. Cal watched without speaking. His arms crossed, his expression shifting from the guarded skepticism of a competent man confronting unfamiliar competence to something more careful, more attentive. "The clay for mortar comes from below the frost line." She tapped the floor. 6 inches down. Mix it with dry grass or straw. The fibers hold it through the expansion when the fire heats up. 3 days to cure before you light anything. She turned from the drawing to look at him directly. "You have both on your land. The hillside behind your barn has the same southern exposure. You can build this." Cal looked at the drawing for a long time. His jaw worked. "My father would have known how to do this." It wasn't self-pity, it was the statement of a specific loss, a gap in inherited knowledge that had nearly cost him his children. "Now you know." Her voice carried no performance of generosity in it, no theatrical warmth. It was simply true. "You owe me one thing. When the thaw comes, you teach someone else." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the way men of his generation acknowledged debts that couldn't be paid in money. He took the rope, put it around his waist, went back out into the blue-white cold to bring his wife home. Nettie Sims arrived 2 days later, carrying her youngest on her back and pulling the other 2 on a wooden sled. She brought a sack of flour, as though showing up to a neighbor's door empty-handed was simply not something she was capable of doing even now. Reverend Oakes came the day after alone, his horse having gone lame in the cold, walking the 4 miles from Garrison in temperatures that had dropped to 38 below at night. He arrived without his hat. He had given it to a man he passed on the road, whose ears were white with frostbite, and his bald head was wrapped in his own scarf. Wren warmed them all. She fed them from her stores, calculating the subtraction against what remained with the running precision of someone who has decided that the math has to work and is prepared to make it work through reduction of her own share. The chamber that had been sized for 1 person adapted itself reluctantly to 5 adults and 3 children for overlapping periods, sleeping in shifts, the heated stones doing continuous rotation from firebox to tent and back. On the 3rd night of Oakes' stay, when the children were asleep in the blanket tent, and Nettie was dozing against the south wall. Wren sat with the Reverend beside the small stove and read to him from the Meditations. Not because she thought he needed instruction in philosophy, but because the book was there, and the night was long, and the silence between two people who have been through something together can sometimes hold more than conversation. She read the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Oakes was quiet for a long moment, looking at the stove, at the stone walls, at the careful drawing still visible in charcoal on the far side of the chamber. "Your father built a church," he said finally, meaning it as the highest praise available to him. Wren considered this. "He built a school," she said. "The distinction matters." Hart came on a day when the temperature had briefly mockingly risen to 10 below, nearly warm by the standards of that January. He rode rather than walked, which told her he hadn't yet reached the place of total defeat, only the outer edges of it. He found the hatch without difficulty, following Decker's old tracks, and he spent several minutes examining the juniper, the stone slab, the vent pipe, before he began probing the snowpack around the entrance with the toe of his boot, searching for the pipe outlet with purposeful intent. He had come to block it. She had heard him arrive, heard the horse, heard the particular sound of a man moving around the exterior of a structure with intent. She came up through the hatch with the maul in her right hand, not raised, just present. The cold hit her face like a flat palm. Hart turned. The surprise on his face lasted less than a second before the mask came back. He looked at the maul, then at her, then at the vent pipe he had located in the snow near the juniper's base, 4 inches of iron covered by a small angled cap her father had fashioned to keep snow out. 3 inches of blocking packed around that pipe opening would have ended everything in the chamber below within a day. Suffocation or cold, whichever arrived first. He looked back at her face. What he found there was not anger or fear. It was something quieter than either, the absolute steadiness of a person who has already calculated the worst outcomes and made her peace with every one of them. There was nothing he could threaten that she hadn't already sat with in the dark. "This is my land." His voice had a tightness in it she hadn't heard before. "Everything beneath this snow belongs to me by legal right." Wren said nothing for a long moment. The cold sat between them. Then, "The pipe is structural. Block it, and the air inside goes foul in 12 hours. 3 children are sleeping down there." She let that settle. "You've been a great many things since October, Mr. Hart. Don't become this one." Something moved behind his eyes. He looked at the pipe. He looked at the maul. He looked at the valley below, the white expanse of it, the frozen indifference of the landscape that owed him nothing. He turned his horse around. As he rode, his voice came back over his shoulder, stripped of its usual legal precision, raw at the edges. "Let the winter have you." It was not a legal claim. It was not a strategy. It was the sound of a man who has run out of instruments and is left with only his voice, and whose witness, unknown to him, would be 3 families who had heard every word. She watched him until the horse disappeared over the first ridge. Then she went back down the steps, pulled the hatch closed. Above her stood in the warm dark for a moment before relighting the candle. Nettie looked up from the corner where she was mending a child's sock. "Was that him?" "It was." Wren hung the maul back on its nail. "He'll come back when he needs water." Nettie's needle paused. "You sound certain." "The ground is." She picked up the Meditations, found her page, sat down beside the small, persistent fire. It always outlasts the argument. The days that followed settled into a pattern that was almost domestic in its regularity, which was itself a kind of victory. The victory of the ordinary over the extraordinary, of routine, established in the teeth of circumstances designed to prevent it. Wren divided each day into thirds. The first third belonged to maintenance. The fire, the stones, the food, the goat. The second belonged to instruction. The third belonged to sleep, or to the Meditations, or to the silence that was not empty but full of the sounds the earth made when you were quiet enough to hear them. The slow creak of frozen timber above the distant percussion of ice shifting in Copperhead Creek, a quarter-mile below. The particular compressed silence of deep snow that is not silence at all, but the sound of weight holding still. Cal Brandt had begun his shelter 3 days after leaving the hatch with Wren's drawing committed to memory. He had brought Mabel back, had gotten her into the warmth, had watched her fever break on the second day, with a relief so physical it had left him shaking. Then he had gone outside and started digging, working through cold that would have stopped most men, because the alternative was no longer acceptable as a possible future. He sent his oldest boy to the hatch on the fourth day with a message scratched on a piece of bark. Wall is up. Stove curing. Did I put the exhaust pipe too close to the intake? Wren sent the boy back with a piece of charcoal and a fresh drawing. She added a line at the bottom. The bearing wall is the hardest part. Once that holds, the rest follows. He had gotten the exhaust placement wrong too close, which would have created a short circuit in the airflow, the warm exhaust mixing back into the intake before it fully cleared. He corrected it, added 6 inches of separation, set the mortar for a second cure. On the 8th day, he lit his first fire in his own shelter. His note said nothing. He sent the boy back with 3 strips of dried venison wrapped in cloth, the last of their stores, and Wren understood it for what it was, not payment, not charity in either direction, but the currency of people who have decided to be responsible to each other. Reverend Oakes returned to Garrison when the temperature lifted briefly in mid-January, carrying the charcoal drawing he had copied onto paper in his careful clerical hand. He held services that Sunday in a church where the communion wine had nearly frozen in its vessel the week before. He did not deliver a sermon on faith or endurance. He held up the drawing, the firebox, the cold sink, the paired pipes, and told the congregation that the most honest theology he had encountered that winter was geometry, that a south-facing slope 4 feet of frost line, a properly sealed clay joint, constituted a form of grace that required no intermediary. Several of the older men in the congregation shifted uncomfortably. Several of the women wrote down the dimensions before he folded the paper. By the 3rd week of January, 4 families in the valley had begun digging. 3 of them had received instruction from someone who had received it from Wren, who had received it from Alistair, who had learned the geometry from Silas Drum, who had carried it out of the Virginia Hill Country after a war had stripped everything else away. Knowledge moved through the valley like groundwater not visible on the surface, finding the low places by gravity pooling where it was needed. Hart's situation did not improve. The green lumber barn continued to gap at its joints as the unseasoned wood contracted in the sustained cold, and the cattle he had staked his future on sickened in ways that money in the middle of a Montana blue norther could not address. His prize bull, a Hereford imported from a breeder in Kansas at considerable expense, developed a lung condition that the veterinarian in Garrison could not treat without supplies unavailable until the thaw. His housekeeper observed that the Callaway homestead cabin consumed firewood at twice the rate of a well-built structure and began wearing her coat indoors. The well froze on the 22nd of January. It froze not at the surface where a fire could have been lit to thaw it, but 3 feet down in a section of pipe that ran through an uninsulated section of the wellhouse wall. Hart spent an entire day attempting remedies, boiling water poured down the shaft, a fire built in the wellhouse itself that cracked one of the foundation stones and achieved nothing. By evening, his cattle had not been properly watered in 18 hours. He walked to the hatch on the 23rd, as Wren had said he would. He walked rather than rode. The horse needed its water before anything else, and he had given it the last of what he had stored in the kitchen. He carried the bucket without premeditation, had simply picked it up on the way out the door, the way you pick up a tool whose purpose is obvious. He knocked on the stone slab. The sound was almost formal. When it opened, he held up the bucket. Wren took it without speaking, went to the stove where a large pot of snowmelt was already heated, filled the bucket, brought it back up the steps, handed it to him. He stood in the snow holding a bucket of warm water that had been given to him without a single word of negotiation, without a condition, without the particular pleasure of the wrong party extracting acknowledgement from the one who wronged them. His face moved through several expressions before settling on something that was not quite humility, but was its immediate precursor, the expression of a man standing at the edge of a recognition he hasn't yet been willing to cross. The well house. His voice was level, careful. There's a section of uninsulated wall where the pipe runs through. Pack it. She stood at the hatch, opening her arms folded against the cold. Straw pine boughs, snow itself will work if it's packed dense enough. Bank the foundation on the north side, you're losing ground heat through the base. She paused. The well house needs a small heat source inside, a lamp even, enough to keep the air above freezing. He nodded. His expression was the expression of a student who has received instruction he can't yet decide whether to resent or implement. The cattle. His voice dropped a register. The shelter. The gaps in the barn. Your barn was built with green lumber. It's going to gap regardless this winter. She kept her tone the same as it would have been for Cal Brandt or Nettie Sims or anyone else standing at her door in the cold with a problem that had a solution. For the animals, hang tarpaulins across the back third, create a smaller space their body heat can maintain. Pack the worst gaps with rags and clay. The bull needs to be in the smallest enclosed space you can make that he'll tolerate. Hart looked at her for a long moment. He had a piece of paper inside his coat that said 160 acres were his, that bore a judge's seal and a forged dead man's signature. He had not thought about it in 3 days. He had been thinking about water. My father's name is on that document. Her voice was quiet without heat. You know what the ink tells you. I knew it the first morning. She held his gaze without pressing it. The rest of the valley will know it by spring. The question you have to answer isn't legal. She went back down the steps. The hatch settled into place above him. Hart stood in the cold for another moment, holding the bucket of warm water, looking at the juniper tree, whose roots had grown for 11 years over a stone door that a man had built specifically because he had anticipated this winter. This dispute, this exact confrontation between paper and ground, and had decided long before it arrived which one he trusted to last. He walked back toward the homestead with the bucket. Behind him, from somewhere under the snow, a thread of smoke continued its patient ascent into the clear blue Montana sky, straight up, undisturbed by wind, certain of its direction. The coldest night came without announcement, the way the worst things do not, with the drama of a storm building on the horizon, but with a simple total descent, the temperature dropping through the floor of every previous record the valley had kept, and continuing downward into territory that had no name in ordinary experience. The mercury in the thermometer Wren kept in the outer chamber touched 41 below zero on the 15th of January, held there for 6 hours, then held there for 6 more. At that temperature, the distinction between cold as a condition and cold as a lethal force collapsed entirely. Inside the blanket tent, with the heated stones rotated fresh from the firebox 2 hours prior, the thermometer read 62 degrees. Nettie's youngest daughter, 4 years old, had stopped shaking for the first time in 3 days. She lay curled against her mother's side with the absolute unguarded trust of a small animal that has been brought to safety and knows it without needing to understand why. Nettie herself was awake, watching the candle stub burn her face, carrying the exhausted piece of a woman who has been afraid for so long that the absence of immediate crisis feels almost like joy. Wren sat outside the tent in the main chamber, close enough to the stove to feel its discipline. The small, controlled burn 3 splits an hour, no more. She had the meditations open on her knee, but was not reading. She was listening. The sounds the earth made at 41 below were different from its sounds at milder temperatures. The timbers above her head made a slow, deep ticking, contracting in the cold, each sound like a knuckle being cracked by a very large and very patient hand. The stone walls said nothing. They had been through worse in geological terms and had no opinion about this particular winter. She thought about her father's list. 7 names. She had reached 5 of them. Edmund Hart was the first name. She had given him what she gave the others, the specific, usable information that stood between his animals and death. She had not forgiven him. Forgiveness was a different transaction entirely, one that operated on a longer timeline. But her father had understood something she was still learning, that teaching a person is not the same as forgiving them. That knowledge offered without condition is its own complete act requiring nothing back. The 6th name on the list was Roy Decker. Decker came to her in the first week of February, when the blue norther had finally begun to exhaust itself, the temperature rising to a comparative mercy of 15 below. He came alone on horseback, and he carried a leather document case she recognized as the kind the county land office used for official records. He dismounted at the juniper without being asked. Tied, the horse stood at the hatch opening with the document case held in both hands. Something in his posture had changed since October. The professional neutrality was gone, replaced by a more effortful composure, the bearing of a man who has made a decision that cost him something. Wren came up through the hatch, her breath rising, her face hollowed by 3 months of rationed living, but her eyes carrying the same level attention they always had. Perhaps more of it now, the way a blade that has been used regularly holds its edge better than one kept in a drawer. He opened the case. Inside, protected by a cotton sleeve, was a single document, a purchase order from the Garrison Mercantile Supply Company, dated March 14, 1881, for 1 gross of Hartley's concentrated writing ink, Black delivered to Edmund J. Hart commercial account. The ink was a mill-ground formulation. The document was stamped with the mercantile seal. I found it when I went back through the land office records. Decker's voice was even the voice of a man delivering testimony rather than conversation. The ink used on your father's transfer document, I had the Helena Court's copy examined. The formulation is identical to the Hartley's concentrate. That product wasn't manufactured before 1880. The deed it was used on is dated 1879. He paused. He signed a contract using ink that didn't exist on the date he claims to have signed it. Wren looked at the purchase order. She had known about the ink since the first morning, had recognized the uniform blackness, the particular sheen of the mill-ground concentrate. She had said nothing because saying so would have accomplished nothing then. A woman alone on a contested homestead pointing to ink color as evidence of fraud would have been noted in the county record as an emotional objection and dismissed before the week was out. She had needed the winter. She had needed the valley to watch what the earth could do, had needed the testimony of Cal Brandt's surviving family. Nettie Sims's children, the Reverend's rewritten theology, the simple fact of smoke rising from a hillside when every reasonable expectation said there should be none. She had needed many people, people whose word carried weight in a county courthouse, to be present for the argument the ground had been making all along. I knew about the ink. Her voice was quiet without apology. The first day. Decker absorbed this. You waited. I needed witnesses. She looked at him steadily. A piece of evidence means what the room decides it means. I needed the room to already know what kind of man he was. Decker was silent for a long moment, looking at the document in his hands, then at the thin thread of smoke still rising from the vent pipe. When he looked back at her, his expression had resolved into something he hadn't shown her before, the particular look of a person who has just understood a plan that was more patient than anything they would have conceived themselves. The circuit judge arrives in Garrison the first week of April. He closed the case carefully. I'll be there. With this. A pause. I believe others will be there as well. They will. She had no doubt about this. The valley remembered what it owed. The thaw came gradually in March, the temperature lifting a degree at a time. Over the course of 2 weeks, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes, first dark patches of earth emerging like something rising to the surface after a long submersion. Copperhead Creek, which had been a compressed silence under 2 feet of ice for 4 months, began to speak again. First in small voices at the edges, then in the full assertive rush of snowmelt. Wren emerged from the hatch on a morning in mid-March when the air for the first time smelled of something other than cold. A faint mineral scent, the smell of wet stone and dark soil breathing. She stood on the hillside above the valley for a long time, looking at what the winter had arranged. 4 structures that had not existed in October now sat in the hillsides above various homestead claims. Rough, unpretty, entirely functional, the shelters that Cal Brandt and 3 other families had built from her father's geometry. They did not look like architecture. They looked like the ground had chosen to express itself in a particular way, which was close to the truth. She walked down to the homestead for the first time since November. The cabin stood. Hart had kept a fire going through the winter, had kept the pipes from freezing, had accomplished the basic maintenance of a structure he occupied without understanding. The woodpile she had built through September was mostly gone. The adze marks her father had left on the porch boards were still there unchanged. She did not go inside. She sat on the chopping block and looked at the valley coming back to life and thought about what came next, which was a trial, which was a room full of people, which was the particular discomfort of turning a private knowledge into a public fact. The circuit judge arrived on April 8, 1884. His name was Clarence Whitmore, and he had been riding the territorial circuit for 14 years, had heard claims and counterclaims across 6 counties, had developed a reliable immunity to dramatic presentation and a corresponding attention to material fact. He set up in Garrison's largest room, the feed store. Its floor swept its scale, pushed to one wall, and heard cases in the order they were filed. The Callaway matter was third on the docket. The room was full before the judge arrived. Cal Brandt stood near the back wall with his wife, his hands showing the damage that January had done. 2 fingers that would not fully recover held quietly at his sides. Nettie Sims sat in the second row with her 3 children arranged beside her in descending size. Reverend Oakes occupied a chair at the end of the front row, his hat on his knee, the charcoal drawing he had made from Wren's original folded in his breast pocket. 12 other people from the valley filled the remaining chairs and the standing space along the walls, people whose presence in the room was itself a form of testimony. Edmund Hart sat on the left side of the room. He had come alone. His attorney had sent a message the previous week declining to appear in person, citing a prior engagement in Helena that everyone understood to be a professional judgment about which side of this proceeding represented the greater liability. Hart's coat was still good wool, but it had lost something since October. The unconscious ease was gone, replaced by a deliberateness of presentation that was almost worse, a man performing confidence rather than possessing it. Roy Decker sat beside the judge's table with the leather document case on his knee. Wren sat on the right side of the room in her cleanest wool shirt, her dark hair tied back, her calloused hands folded on the table in front of her. She had not hired an attorney. She had something the law did not have: a formal category for a room full of people who had survived a winter in structures built from the knowledge she had distributed freely, who had come here not because they were summoned, but because they had decided this was the correct place to be on this particular morning. Judge Whitmore reviewed the documents first in silence, with the unhurried attention of a man accustomed to reading what paper claims against what it cannot say. The transfer deed, the notary seal, the purchase order for Hartley's concentrated writing ink, dated March 1881, 2 years after the deed it was used to forge. He set them side by side on the table, looked at them together, looked at them separately. Decker testified to the provenance of the purchase order, to his examination of the Helena court copy, to the formulation discrepancy. He added in the measured tone of a man who has decided to be thorough that he had personally witnessed Edmund Hart approach the Callaway shelter on a day in January and attempt to locate the ventilation pipe with apparent intent to obstruct it, an act that would have endangered the lives of the women and children sheltering inside. His voice did not waver. 3 families in the room had been present for that moment on the hillside. None of them contradicted him. Cal Brandt spoke next, not called, but standing when the judge acknowledged the room's desire to contribute. He described the night he had brought his children to a stone chamber in a hillside, described the drawing on the wall, described the instruction he had received and replicated. He held up his damaged hand not as theater, but as simple illustration. The shelter she taught me to build kept my family alive. His voice rough with the particular roughness of a man who doesn't speak about the things that matter until he absolutely must. He sat down. The room was very quiet. Nettie Sims stood briefly and said that she had worked in a general store for 11 years before her husband died and had kept records of every product the store carried, and that Hartley's concentrate had been on their shelves since the spring of 1881, and not a day before, and that she would stake her children's lives on that fact, which she understood she had already done. Reverend Oakes held up the charcoal drawing he had copied from Wren's wall and said, "This is what knowledge looks like when it belongs to everyone. I have given this drawing to 11 families in my congregation. I will give it to 11 more. Whatever this court decides about property lines, it cannot undo the fact that this information has already passed beyond any one person's ability to contain or withhold." He sat down. Hart did not look at him. Wren was asked to speak last. She stood and looked at the room, not at the judge, not at Hart, but at the room itself, the specific collection of people Winter had assembled here. She spoke about her father, not about the fraud, not about the forgery, not about the morning Hart had arrived with his sealed document. She spoke about a summer afternoon in 1872, a south-facing hillside, a man explaining thermal mass to a 15-year-old girl as though it were the most important thing in the world, which it had turned out to be. She described the list of 7 names. She said that the first name on the list was Edmund Hart, that her father had written it there not from bitterness, but from the conviction that the man most likely to cause harm was also, if the winter were cold enough, the man most likely to learn something. She looked at Hart when she said this. His face was very still. "My father built that shelter for the whole valley," she said. "He just built it on our land because that was the land he trusted." She sat down. Judge Whitmore examined the documents for another 10 minutes in complete silence. When he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of a man announcing a conclusion that the evidence has made inevitable. The deed of transfer was void. The ink formulation discrepancy was sufficient in itself to constitute grounds for nullification. The additional testimony, including the witnessed attempt to obstruct the ventilation structure, made the matter unambiguous. The Callaway homestead, 160 acres including water rights and all improvements, was confirmed in the ownership of Wren Callaway as the legal heir of Alistair W. Callaway. Any party wishing to contest the ruling had 30 days to file in Helena. Hart did not contest. He sat in the feed store room while the room around him quietly reorganized itself into the shape of a community that had come through something together. Then he stood, picked up his hat, walked to the door. He did not look at Wren. He did not look at Decker. He opened the door and walked out into the April morning, and the space he left behind was less than he would have predicted, which was perhaps the final and most complete verdict on a man who had mistaken the size of his paper claims for the size of his actual presence in the world. The years that followed had the quality of something that has found its proper shape and settled into it. Wren moved back into the homestead cabin that spring, repaired the north wall with proper seasoned lumber, caulked the gaps her father would have been embarrassed to leave. She kept the hatch on the hillside in good repair, adding a mortared stone chimney in 1887 that improved the draft efficiency considerably, a small south-facing window in 1891 that made the winter hours less relentless. People called it the Vault by the late 1880s, a name that attached itself to the place with the organic persistence of names that fit. Cal Brandt recovered full use of 3 of his 4 affected fingers. He became in the way of men who have learned something important under duress, a dedicated transmitter of that knowledge teaching shelter, construction to every homesteader who would listen, organizing a communal dig for a valley family who lost their cabin to fire, in 1886, consulting with 3 ranchers on the proper insulation of well houses before the winter of 1888. He came to Wren's door every October until the decade turned, sometimes with questions, sometimes with news, sometimes simply standing on the porch with a sack of dried beans from his harvest, offering it the way a person offers the thing they have, when what they owe cannot be precisely calculated. Hazel the goat, who had navigated that first terrible winter with her customary indifference to drama, lived another 6 years and was replaced by 2 younger animals of similar temperament, as though Wren had selected for stubbornness on purpose, which she had. Nettie Sims opened a winter school in the Vault in 1885, teaching reading to 11 children whose families lived too far from Garrison School to attend regularly. She taught in the same chamber where Wren had fed her children hot broth in January of 1884, beside the same stove under the same timbered ceiling. The children sat on flat stones Nettie had carried down the steps herself and learned their letters by candlelight, while the snow pressed its patient weight against the hillside above them. Reverend Oakes distributed the shelter diagram through every congregation he visited on his circuit, for the next decade a piece of practical theology that had no denomination. He stopped delivering sermons about faith as an abstraction and found that congregations responded more reliably to the concrete evidence of things that worked. He and Wren did not become close friends. They were too different in temperament for ease, both too economical, with words that didn't carry weight, but they respected each other with the particular warmth of people who have seen each other at the actual bottom of something. Roy Decker served 3 more terms as sheriff. He tipped his hat to Wren every time he passed her on the road through Garrison, a gesture that began as acknowledgement and accumulated over the years into something closer to reverence, the way small, consistent acts do when they are performed with genuine intention. On the last day he served as sheriff in the spring of 1897, he stopped at the homestead and left on her porch the leather document case containing the ink purchase order and his own written account of how he had found it. He did not knock. He understood she would know what it was. Edmund Hart was gone from the territory before summer. He sold his holdings in May of 1884 at a price that reflected what the market in a valley that knew his name would bear, which was less than he had paid. He went East Helena, then Chicago, then a city no one in Harlan's Bluff ever heard further news from. The housekeeper stayed and hired herself out to 3 families in the valley. She was a good cook and an excellent record keeper, and she never once mentioned her previous employer. Wren lived on the Callaway land for 43 more years. She did not marry. The life she had built was complete in a way that addition would have changed, rather than improved the way adding a room to a well-proportioned house changes the proportions. Every autumn, starting in September, when the first cold descended from the peaks of Sable Ridge, people came. Not charity seekers, students. They came with questions, with notebooks, with the particular, purposeful attention of people who understand they are receiving something worth keeping. She taught them what Alistair had taught her, and what she had refined through 40 winters of application. The physics of thermal mass, the logic of the paired pipes, the selection of stone for dry stack construction, the properties of clay mortar, and the patience it required. She taught the way her father had taught, not as a lecture, but as a conversation between equals, one of whom happened to know more about this particular subject. The knowledge moved. It moved through families and then through generations became part of the practical vocabulary of the region. One of those things that people in a place know without always knowing where they learned it. By 1910, the principles Alistair had applied on that hillside in 1872 had shaped the construction of shelters on at least 60 properties across 3 counties. By 1920, several of those properties had been owned by 2 successive generations of people who had grown up understanding thermal mass as a basic fact of winter life. In the summer of 1914, a journalist came from the Billings Gazette to write a feature on the stonemason's daughter of Harlan's Bluff. He was 28 years old, earnest, carrying a new camera he was still learning to manage. He wanted quotable lines about frontier survival, about female resilience, about the romance of the homestead. He had prepared a list of questions that had the particular quality of questions composed by someone who has already decided the answers. She sat with him on the porch of the cabin in the afternoon light. She was 57 that summer, her hair fully gray, her hands gnarled as juniper root, her posture as straight as the day she had stood beside a chopping block and watched 2 men approach with a piece of paper and answered his questions with the same economy she had always applied to words that needed to do actual work. He asked what she was most proud of. She looked out at the valley for a moment. "Getting the flue angle right on the first build," she said. He laughed, thinking it was self-deprecation. She had meant it exactly. He asked what she would tell young women facing impossible circumstances. She considered this seriously. The circumstances are rarely as impossible as the paper describing them suggests. She looked at him. And paper is not the same thing as ground. He asked whether she considered herself a hero. She stood up, indicating the interview was finished. "My father built the school," she said. "I just kept it open." She went inside. He published the piece in October of 1914. It ran with a photograph of the vault's entrance, the juniper roots across the stone slab, the vent pipe rising from the snow that had come early that year. The piece was reprinted in 4 other Montana papers, and once in a journal of practical engineering in Philadelphia, where the editor had found the ventilation pipe design interesting on its own technical merits. Wren did not read any of them. She had a winter to prepare for. She died on the 4th of March, 1927, in the cabin her father had built, in the bed she had slept in since childhood, in the particular deep quiet of a late winter night, when the snow is thick on the roof and the fire has banked itself to coals. The thermometer outside read 12 degrees. Inside the cabin, held at 58, the north wall rebuilt twice in the intervening decades to the standard Alistair had intended. She had been reading the Meditations that evening, the same copy the spine now held together by a length of twine she had tied around it in 1906 when the last thread of the binding finally gave way. The book was open on the blanket beside her when her neighbor, coming to check on her in the morning, found her expression composed, her hands at rest, the thinking stone dark, flat oval worn to a shine on one side folded between them. The stone had been in her coat pocket the night she walked into the hills with a goat and a maul and 30 feet of rope. It had been in her pocket every winter morning since. She had never put it on a shelf. She had decided early on that her father's presence was not something to display, but something to carry. By 1961, when the Garrett family purchased the property, the cabin had long since returned to the soil. But the vault had not. The Garrett boy, 17 that summer, and given to exploring the property's back acres before his father's herd arrived, found the juniper first, then the stone slab beneath its roots, then the steps. He went down into 50-degree air with a flashlight and stood in a space that had been sealed for 34 years. The walls were exactly as they had been built in the summer of 1872. The dry stack stones fitted with a precision that required no mortar and had needed none. The small stove stood in its corner intact. The flue rose to the ceiling timber at the angle Wren had drawn for Cal Brandt in charcoal. During the coldest winter, the valley had recorded the angle she had learned from a drawing her father had left in an oilskin pouch for her to find when she needed it. On the east wall at shoulder height, in letters scratched into the stone with an iron nail, a sentence the earth remembers. So should you. He didn't know who had written it. He didn't know the name Calloway, didn't know about the winter of 1883, didn't know about a woman who had walked west into a snowstorm rather than surrender a piece of ground that paper claimed, but Earth remembered differently. He was 17, standing in a cool stone room that had no business being as solid as it was after nearly a century, and the sentence on the wall made the hair on his arm stand. He went back up the steps. He told his father about the room. His father came down, walked the perimeter, knocked on the walls, examined the stove, read the sentence. He was a practical man who had built and repaired structures his whole life, could read the quality of construction the way Wren had read the quality of her father's handwriting. He stood in the center of the vault for a long time. Then he went back up into the Montana afternoon, walked to the juniper, looked at the valley spreading south. The same valley, the same light, the same geometry of ridge and creek and slope that had been there since before anyone had put a name to it. "We'll keep it," he said, meaning the vault, meaning they would not fill it or seal it or pretend it wasn't there. He didn't know yet what he was keeping. He would learn. The property had a way of teaching what it knew to people who were willing to go underground and listen. The vent pipe still functioned. On cold mornings that fall, before the Garrett family had moved in fully, before the cattle arrived, before the ordinary business of living had resumed on the Callaway land, a thin thread of air moved through the iron pipe. The way air has always moved from the cold side toward the warm, from the high pressure toward the low, from the place of accumulation toward the place of release. And the juniper's roots held the stone in place above the steps. The same roots that had been growing since Alistair Callaway had let them, had made his peace with their slow encroachment, had understood that the things worth building were the things worth letting the earth hold in its own way, in its own time, against whatever winter arrived next, with its piece of paper and its cold conviction that everything could be taken. The ground had a different opinion. It always had.